52% of American millennials would like to live in a socialist or communist America. Socialism here in America.
Good morning, patriots. Good morning, rebels.
And maybe we need a solution to it that risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
I don't even care about those guys. It really just honestly doesn't matter. Have you heard about the SJW nonsense? I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Hashtag me too.
You have a wonderful day, bro, and I'll see you again soon.
I would say to my brothers and sisters of all colors here in this magnificent state of South Carolina, I challenge you, can you meet the standards of the great ones who have already come out of this state? Do you really know who Robert Smalls was? The creator of the first public school system in the whole nation. Because he had an understanding of greatness. Somewhere he read, he or she is greatest among you will be your servant. We'll focus on the least of these. We'll focus on those catching hell. Do you really know who Marion Wright Edelman is? South Carolina. The great prophetic voice building on the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, still strong at 79 years old in a city that used to be chocolate called Washington, D.C. Do you really know who Jesse Jackson is? From this town, that this magnificent vanilla brother named Bernie Sanders stood with a chocolate brother named Jesse Jackson in 1988 and said, we need to talk about poverty, we need to talk about wealth, we need to bring all of us together no matter what color, because we have a commitment to integrity and principle, and we're concerned about the least of these, but you have to have courage. We've been living in an age for 40 years where too many folk are still scared and intimidated. Walking around laughing when it ain't funny and smiling when... You got to straighten your backs up. You got to call into question some of your milquetoast centrist leadership who's not telling the truth and say, we have voices too. We concerned about something too. And if you really have that kind of care, you really have that kind of concern, then you have courage, then you have a moral consistency. What I love about this brother is not that he's a god, not that he's a deity, he's a human being trying to be morally consistent and bear witness in such a way that he can bring us together and change this nation.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else with soup. Are we all right, guys? Is there a problem? Should we reset? Okay, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, Reniqua Allen. She's author of It Was All a Dream. We're talking about African-American millennials, hope, despair, the American dream, race, class, politics, and one of the greatest songs ever made. Then Ben Burgis returns. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. We're going to be reviewing the Zizek-Peterson debate, Zizek's triumph, but we're going to use that as a door to open up an intellectual history from Hegel to Marx. Who really wants and values freedom? Probably actually everybody. We're going to be talking about that, plus a new ad that Crew, the legendary Bhaskar Sunkara, cut an ad for Bernie. We're going to talk about that. Plays on these themes. I'm reading Bhaskar's new book. Excellent new book. We'll be talking with him soon. Plus, David Griscom is talking about strikes scheduled for across to the country tomorrow, focusing on the rideshare scam. Shout out to New York City. They didn't send J.R. Bolsonaro packing because that fascist isn't coming to begin with. Plus, a whole lot more. An Iran update as Saudi Arabia and the United States continue to push to sort of maneuver for a justification for a absolutely catastrophic foreign policy monstrosity that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, that those thugs want. We'll revisit Venezuela, Bernie Sanders' cable access archives, and a whole bunch more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. But first, we want to talk about actually something of a shout out too. Last week's in the across the globe, climate extinction activists held the world's attention in a direct action extinction rebellion across the planet to resist the mass environmental crisis, not just climate, but the structural collapse, the structural assault, what I believe Eric Levitz is calling the murder-suicide pact between humanity and planet Earth. Let's watch this video from Extinction Rebellion to see what they're talking about.
We did ask the government wave this year.
The warmest day ever.
12 degrees
becoming increasingly common.
The breakdown of our climate has begun. The ecological crisis can no longer be ignored.
This government has a fine record on climate change.
We are in open rebellion against our government, and we call upon every principled and peaceful citizen to rise with us. We have 3 demands. The government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. The government must commission a National Citizens' Assembly, a group of citizens chosen by lot and reflective of the demographics of the UK, together with experts and stakeholders, to vote on recommendations on the climate and ecological emergency. We refuse to leave a dying planet to future generations by failing to act now.
Just this past month, a draft UN report stated that over 1 million species face extinction, and it's our fault, more specifically capitalism and industrialization's fault. If we don't learn how to both transition out of capitalism and radically redefine industrialism, we will not get out of this crisis. The coming mass extinction event is already here, and unlike the one 66 million years ago, caused by a fast approaching asteroid, but unlike a previous cosmic event, we can stop this. We can actually act now to radically to end emissions carbon emissions, to stop deforestation, to stop species depletion, to radically invest in mass transit, to regenerate ecology across the globe, to protect oceans, to stop so-called externalities in the rapacious action of global capitalism. We need to radically rescale and reorient our consumption. That means keeping oil reserves in the ground. Good luck doing that in a free market system, period. But beyond that, we need to change the way we live. Fundamental to capitalism is the idea of infinite growth. But on a finite planet, that's impossible and leads to the environmental catastrophe we face today. Now, this does not mean some type of fold back into the woodwork fantasy. There's going to need to be multiple paths that are taken, including, of course, a life with infinitely less cars, more walking, more public transportation, more densely populated communities, as well as a transition to fleets that still exist off of off of carbon consumption. It's going to take place on every single sector, every single level of human and collective behavior. But if you don't have the fundamental confrontation with the logic of endless growth and the insane notion of externalities, which is fundamental to capitalism, those externals will ruin the viability of human life on the planet. In the UK, Extinction Rebellion has been an inspiring development over the past couple of weeks. The group staged mass protests in London. They shut down targeted areas, bringing parts of the city to a halt. The moves, which have included activists gluing themselves to the pavement, have been drastic, and they've been drastic to highlight the urgency of the moment, something that those in power and criminal fossil fuel companies have refused to recognize. They've achieved results. Last week, the Labour Party brought a motion forward in Parliament declaring climate to be a national emergency. Now, the Tories' Environment Minister, Michael Gove, actually agreed in principle, but of course has refused to follow through on any of the necessary policy actions. Marking the vote momentum, and Extinction Rebellion will hold another demonstration outside of Parliament before the vote. In the U.S., we have the promise of a Green New Deal to vote for, but we need mobilization to achieve it. We are up against some of the most powerful forces in history. This is especially true because we have too many fair-weather friends. If they're already fickle with their rhetoric and even more fickle with their actions, real action and symbolic action are different things, and we need a strong movement that can create support for changes that we need to see, that we can build off of recent successes of Extinction Rebellion and other crucial modes of activism like the landless workers movement and indigenous peoples movements across the globe. But it is also fundamental to think of what we do if we don't confront this. There's the global justice dimension that developing countries, particularly as an example, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, South Asia, places that contribute the least to the problem structurally, are already facing the disproportionate consequences. Then there's the other reality that, of course, even within our own societies, mass inequities mask the radically disproportionate effects of, as an example, how climate works and affects people in the United States. Look at a catastrophe like Katrina and how it affected vulnerable, poor, oppressed communities versus ones that weren't. And then look at all of the major collapses in social cohesion that we are already dealing with. And imagine a highly weaponized, austerity-driven, micro-segmented capitalist societies. That will be a catastrophe, compounded by a catastrophe. So we need to act now, and we need to put the fundamentals on the table in order to do so. Guys, you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah. You know, what we've seen.
Fucking hey, man.
Hey, man, you just sort of,
I know.
You dropped my heart a little bit thinking about what's coming.
I know, I'm sorry.
And
I'm sorry. We
but,
went deep.
But it's exciting to see what they've done, with Extinction Rebellion. Not only were there massive protests, but there was direct action. For example, there was an industrial waste yard that they planted a massive garden in,
awesome.
which was a really great idea.
Beautiful.
But it shows, I mean, one, how serious the issue is, and two, what you're talking about is like the global ramifications of climate change are going to be huge. Not only the fact that certain countries are going to be hit harder than others, but the fact that developing economies, because if we need to change the way that our system works, they can't go through an industrial revolution like we did in the United States, in the UK, and like China, which have massively devastated the environment in their own way. Not to mention, for example, how terrible the industrial revolution was for the rest of the world with European plundering of other nations. So not only do we need to talk nationally, but we really need to talk internationally about the ways that we're going to solve this issue. And that's something that's very important to talk about in the United States aspect, in the US especially, is how we're going to be able to help other countries prepare for the change and to also support them financially so that they're able to, develop their economies in sustainable green ways.
And reframe the language of crisis. I mean, of course, Brexit is a crisis, but this is arguably the crisis of the time. And it's still always, perpetually on the back burner.
We got some footage. I don't know if this is the garden you're talking about, but they made a garden on, this is one of the bridges. I'm not sure which one here. They set up like a green space, basically. I like how bold they are about, just throwing paint on buildings and stuff.
Me too. They don't care. It's beautiful.
They're touting the number of arrests that they've gotten to. I think they're happy that it reached 1,000.
And one reason I think that this movement was so successful in the UK was the fact that so many people recognize that climate change is a problem and is a threat. But you have that question of like individual action. It's like, what can I do?
Right.
And a lot of people feel very depressed about it. But then you start seeing people in the streets taking action, and it becomes, very attractive to take part of that because people really do recognize what's going on. But most people feel very powerless and are, questioning what there is to do about it. But this is exactly what we need to be doing about it.
100%. All right, guys, let's get to the shout out.
Get to the shout out.
People bitched a little bit last week when we didn't play this whole track, so the brilliant DJ Danarchy.
Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out.
This is crazy.
Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out.
This is out of control.
Shout out, shout out.
That's creepy.
Shout out, shout out.
That's weird.
Shout out,
creepy.
Shout out,
weird.
Shout out,
crazy.
Shout out, shout out.
This is crazy.
Shout out.
This is out of control.
Shout out.
This is weird.
Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out.
Shout out goes to activists and organizers, and I guess in this case, we're going to have to do full honesty, even local politicians that might generally really annoy us in New York City. Jair Bolsonaro, who is the fascist president of Brazil, was set to be honored at an event in New York this month. Initially, the event was going to be at the Natural History Museum. There was huge protests against that. Then the location was changed, I believe, to a Marriott, and corporate sponsors were still there. First, Delta, I believe, pulled out because of the embarrassment of honoring a guy who is internationally known as a bigot, a virulent bigot against indigenous people, against Afro-Brazilians, against the LGBTQ community. He's recently said something, even more recent, pro-homophobic / like quasi maybe pro-sex tourism comments. So again, we always have to reset here that Anglo media, the Western Press, the New York Times, the Guardian, and of course the right-wing papers and so on, helped back or negligibly or ridiculously covered a completely illegitimate process that removed the former president Dilma Rousseff from power in 2016. They've also then basically sat back and either been silent or totally misreported the imprisoning without any actual tangible evidence of former President Lula da Silva, who would almost certainly have won the race. And I think New York City would have been quite happy to have him come to New York and be honored. In fact, right now, he would be a global voice for social democracy and for tolerance in a deep sense. But instead, they went with Jair Bolsonaro. This is an important tweet that Bill de Blasio set off. This is from April 16th. And again, I want to praise de Blasio here because de Blasio has been personally thanked by Workers' Party leader Fernando Haddad, as a matter of fact, right? This is I'm a credit where credit is due person. J.R. Bolsonaro, he's quote tweeting. This is the original thing from the Natural History Museum. With mutual respect for the work and goals of our individual organizations, we jointly agree that the museum is not an optimal location for the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce gala dinner. That would be the dinner that would be honoring J.R. Bolsonaro. Of course, all chambers of commerce are in love with J.R. Bolsonaro's plans to get rid of pensions and pillage the Amazon. This traditional event will go forward at another location in the original date and time. And I believe that rescheduling, now Bolsonaro is just not coming to New York, which is great. Mayor de Blasio wrote, J.R. Bolsonaro is a dangerous man. His overt racism, homophobia, and destructive decisions will have a devastating impact on the future of the planet. On behalf of our city, thank you at AMNH, American Natural History Museum, for canceling this event. Shout out.
And I've heard that he's been scrambling now to come up with a new plan, and that he was potentially going to go to Dallas, Texas.
Oh, I bet.
But now he's not going to Dallas anymore, so now he potentially is going to go to Houston. But it seems like there's a lot of things up in the air for this Brazilian fascist and his U.S. plans.
Well, as Lula said, their country is run by lunatics, and the Brazilian elite needs to look at itself. And of course, the U.S. elite and U.S. foreign policy apparatus needs to look at itself.
This is also an interesting weather vein, because a lot of the type of people who donate to places like the American Museum of Natural History probably just read The Economist and say, like, well, what's wrong with Bolsonaro, right?
Right.
Like, it's not like these aren't woke institutions, typically speaking.
Totally. Bolsonaro. Yeah, I think we need that. That's just best practices.
Bolsonaro.
And again?
Bolsonaro.
Zoolander Dave. I think we finally got it. What do we say that the theory is that Dennis Prager is microdosing Dave Rubin?
What is your opinion on Brazilian Prime Minister Bolsonaro regarding, oops, there's a lot of things moving here, deforestation of the rainforest? P.S. I'm a Christian, I'd bake you a cake, though. I don't know enough about him, but it sounds like he really hates Marxism, and he's really pushing Brazil to become more of a world leader, and that he actually is for capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me. And as a Christian, I appreciate your offer to bake me a cake.
Okay, I would. It's funny. Let's give Dave's 3 for 4. I would say yes, certainly pro-capitalism, definitely interested in getting the SJW stuff out of the public schools, as in like terrorizing gay kids. And then I think what was the other one is he hates Marxism. That's very true.
The world leader, did you?
I was going to say, the world leader one is, I think, the so toxic and grotesque that you can't even do some type of gala event at the American Natural History Museum. I'm going to go with not restoring Brazil. In fact, major downgrade of Brazil's global position.
I think one of the criteria of being a world leader is how well do you fit in with New York's philanthropic community.
And that shouldn't be the case, but it is the case. Yeah. All right. Guys, it's time to become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. Next week during this pitch, we will have we'll throw up on screen a document of just the never-ending. There's so much content you get behind a paywall. And even these new extra streams, which I definitely do not promise every Tuesday, but we've been giving these, international election deep dives with Nando Vila and Mike Hanna. In some ways, those are representative, although these primers and histories go really deep into different parts of the world, into reworking our understanding of, as an example, international law. We just had an amazing one with Kirsten Pear Anderson, Canadian academic, on the problem with international law from a positivist perspective. But then, of course, there's also the post games. We're having just a huge amount of fun. You're going to want to listen to Ben Burgis react in real time to Bernie Sanders asking punks what their outfits represent in the 1980s in Burlington. I'm incredibly proud of what we're doing. In the coming weeks, we'll have announcements on our next tour date. My hint will be Heartland. That's the hint. And also, we're going to get some gear. The gear is like actually ready. I didn't really want to talk about it until it was like ready, but it looks like we actually have 2 designers that have produced dope gear for us, and we're going to be ready to go with a lot of different options in that regard. So competition would start kicking in. So it's time. We need you. We need to continue to grow. I mean, look, we're at a point because of the accomplishments we've had and because of this amazing community we have where like there's a certain level of, stability in terms of like the amount of content and quality we can produce, which we've been consistent on from the beginning. And the next phase is, as I say, it's always making things durable and then also giving us the opportunity, like as an example, the amount of patrons that we've hit has given us the opportunity to have a great talent like Vic Viana come and join us so he can do the video illicit histories for Comrade and Above patrons. The first one on Jesse Jackson and the history of the Rainbow Coalition, featuring the indispensable voice and insight of the great Bill Fletcher Jr. This is a show where you're getting exposed to an incredible range of people. And I think building some of that kind of like necessary, very necessary inward critique, but also the broader strategic vision so that we can actually hopefully play some role in actually winning and achieving some power here to generate a genuinely different politics. And we need you to come on board with us so we can continue to do that and keep getting better and better at everything that we're trying to do. Patreon.com/TMBS. If this is your first time on the YouTube channel, click the subscribe button. And we will be right back with Reniqua Allen, author of It Was All a Dream. This is the Michael Brooks Show. Am I off?
You have to accomplish something in a video game. You have to keep trying to succeed. Yes, can you go to GameFAQs or can you get the cheat code and all that stuff? You do, but it really is about you figuring out how to do all this stuff. And that to me sort of shows why the media, and especially the leftist media, hates games now or hates gamers. They don't like people who solve problems. Is this a bridge too far or am I onto something?
I don't know, I have to think about it. I haven't really thought about it.
I think there's something there. Gamers want to get shit done. Whatever world you're in, whether you're playing a sports game or an adventure game or an RPG or whatever, you're building something, you're accomplishing something. You may have to have teammates and all do it. You don't want people to help you do everything and cheat for you. That's not what the left likes.
Sure.
So they have to not like games. I think there's something really there.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Reniqua Allen. She is author of It Was All a Dream, A New Generation Confronts the Broken Promise to Black America. And she's a journalist, writer, and producer. Reniqua, thanks so much. Are you there?
Yep. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for being here. I want to just play, if we were on like college radio, I would probably just like start a listening party, but we're going to play just probably like 8 seconds and then we'll fade out, but specifically of the lyric you're talking about. And then I'm hoping you can explain why that lyric, why it's so central to the book, but we'll play that for just a few seconds and then fade out.
Okay. Cool.
It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine.
And YouTube sucks. Reniqua, what does that lyric mean to you? Why is that at the center of this book?
Oh man. Well, one, I love Biggie. I'm an older millennial. And so, hip hop is really super near and dear to my heart, but I also see it, and I see that lyric in particular as, a great kind of metaphor for the Black experience, particularly being young and kind of in your 20s and 30s and Black in America today, where, I think there seemed to be so much hope, whether it was when you came of age during kind of what I would say is the golden era of hip hop. I know like a lot of people would be like, oh, that was its downfall. But, I came of age, I think, where there were these, hip hop was actually, it was turning mainstream. It felt like things were possible. You had all these rappers and videos and flaunting money, and not that necessarily means success, but you saw kind of this generation post-civil rights that felt like in some ways they were making it. We saw the election of Barack Obama. No matter like what you think about him politically, I think that was the symbol of it, was really powerful. And now it kind of seems like everything has gone to shit. I mean, it probably, in honesty, was always there, but I feel like, these kind of dreams, the hope, the possibility, all that stuff that I think for me growing up being young and a Black person and probably, idealistic, it really feels like it was a dream. So that really resonated with me.
So and could you trace the track? Like, are you talking like late 80s, like significant cultural figures like Oprah, Jesse Jackson? Are we talking about, I agree with you, in my humble opinion, it's undeniably the golden age, like Biggie, Nas, Jay-Z,
right,
through the election of President Obama? I just want to be really clear on the time parameters. And also when you talk about like the material aspects of it, can you really underline, and tell me if I'm not reading you correctly, but my read is like, if you come from a place racially or economically where a certain, forget luxury, maybe just even basic ease, right? Like I can obviously not speak to the racial part at all, but I can definitely speak to the financial part. If you grew up in a situation where your heat might get turned off, there actually is an incredible allure of the idea of not only being okay, but like of abundance, because maybe you feel so much separation and shame around that in a culture that valorizes it. So when you saw that, it wasn't like, I guess the way I read it was you were talking about this was such an important signifying of specifically young Black people acquiring that in this context and the sense of possibility it opened. So I know I threw you a lot, but I'm asking about timeline and I'm asking about the specific benefits of seeing that kind of like material imagery.
Right. So, timeline wise, I use Q, not to get like super nerdy, and they called the millennial generation from 1980 to around 2000. So I roughly use that time period to look at people who were born, people in their 20s and 30s, and kind of look at, how the culture has changed, right? Like, you do have all these things, and I should note, like, a lot of, okay, let me take it back. Not a lot, but you had government-supported things like affirmative action. Now, of course, in the 80s, that, and in the 90s, that was being contested, but kind of in the post-civil rights generation, there was some legislative efforts, there was some governmental efforts to bring about a black middle class, right? You see more African Americans in public service and going to college, right? You see black folks joining unions more, which is huge. You see a black middle class emerge in ways that they didn't before, kind of in our parents' generation, and I think that kind of contributed to this sense of possibility. Now, I think it's, some of that idea is flawed. It was definitely a very individualistic approach. It was, you work hard and you can get what you want. But I think it was there. And I think that, someone like an Oprah, you see the Cosby Show on television. So, there was, there's some material gains, right? You do see incomes rise. Like I said, you see folks entering the housing market, for example, more than ever black folks. Now that totally gets reversed, right? Like, a couple of decades later. But I think that there is an idea of possibility, and some of it is built in that, material thing. But I think that also culturally, that aspiration, that idea of the American dream, which I still can't figure out why black folks are so tied to it, because obviously America, I think, has shown them over and over again that, the American dream is not really for black people, but we are tied to that as a people. We believe even to this day, and more than white people. And I think a lot of young black people in particular also kind of fed into that, particularly if you're kind of coming of age. I interviewed like over 75 millennials, and some people said, like, I thought, Obama becoming president meant that, racism was coming to an end. Now, there are others who didn't buy into that at all. But, there was, I think, overall, at least a sense of hope, right? Not just his campaign slogan, and a profound disappointment at where we are today with the Trump era.
And what do you think does? I mean, I guess you said you don't know, but I am really curious about I have my own theories, at least on the economic end, but why is it that you think there is still a higher degree of belief in this dream? And also, what is the dream? That, amongst, what is that? Actually, let's start there. I don't know what it is.
Great question. All right. So the dream, I think, is different for everybody. I mean, I think that, for a lot of people, it's doing better than their parents. I think what was really fascinating to me about young people is that today it didn't seem necessarily so rooted in materialism or economic gains. Some people have said, well, it's just not accessible. But I think some other folks are realizing that, it's a little bit of a crock of shit. And we can't necessarily define ourselves by how much we make or, how big our house is. So I thought that was a really interesting finding, that people seem to define the dream in different ways. I think for me, at its core, and I write this in the book, that for young black people in America, the dream seems to mean freedom. It seems to mean, and that obviously means different things to different people, but I think it's being seen as human, which people told me, which I feel over and over again, we constantly get denied. It's being seen as visible. It doesn't necessarily, have to be, rooted in a specific possession, but the dream is to be stable. It's not to die and be able to walk through the streets in a certain way. And I think at its core, that's always what the dream has meant to young black people, though obviously it's been defined in many different ways.
How about the Obama time period of this dream? And tell us How does that play out?
Oh, again, I want to say over and over and over again, like, I think, young Black folks aren't a monolith. Certainly the people I spoke to are not, some people loved Obama, some people hated it. What I did glean from everyone was that there was a sense, maybe not of change, right? Like I think there were definitely a number of young people who didn't think that Obama was a game changer, that like we'd become some socialist society, or, the White House would be painted black and, he'd have, whatever. But I think it felt, and people have said this, it felt like there was a sense of possibility. It was a big deal that a Black man, particularly with the name of Barack Obama. Now, I think Obama and the Obamas in general can embrace some more conservative policies, and, I think that's completely fair game. Obviously, he was not so great on immigration, but I think that it felt like a win for America. It felt like a win for Black people to see that we could elect a Black president. And I don't, given the state of the country now, I don't want to take that moment away from us. I think it was significant.
Do you think, I guess what I meant by the question is, because I actually, right, I mean, I think that's huge in general, to not, I mean, even like Jewish people, right? It's a less complex demographic, but like there is not a Jewish monolithic opinion on anything. And if you want to measure Jewish attitudes, you need to what are we talking about here? Like, are we talking about Manhattan? Are we talking about Miami Beach?
Right.
Are we talking about Long Island? Or are we talking about, the Midwest or the South, which people don't associate? So 100%, I really like that actually comes through in your book, that this is not just like, oh yeah, that's what everybody in a certain demographic thought, because that's ridiculous, period. But specifically you, I mean, how did you think Obama navigated these things in terms, and I guess I also want to like lay my cards on the table, right? Like I am a grubby socialist, and I do like Bernie Sanders, so that's 100% my politics. At the same time, I think there's people sometimes on my side of the equation that don't necessarily recognize like the profundity of the importance of, as an example, Barack Obama being elected president. I mean, I remember that happening in college, and I remember listening to a white kid complain that somebody in his inauguration talked about race, and this white kid was like, "Can we move past this?" And I was like, wow. Even for me, that was my moment of like, oh, this is going to be a weird 8 years. But like, I guess how you thought of the juxtaposition of either how Obama spoke about issues of race and racism specifically, and also, that juxtaposition, not just of like he was conservative on certain policies, but like, right, there's this total meltdown in housing wealth, which is the fault of Wall Street. But we also know that his response to it was not an aggressive, interventionist response.
They didn't get punished at all, right?
And he didn't keep people in their homes with a TARP program either, right? Like, so these are the materials. So how do you think in terms of his role in all of this, in that very specific paradoxical piece of time?
That's a good question. I think that, for a lot of people, right, so housing, let me go back. So I think housing is a huge issue, especially for the people I spoke with. It's a huge issue for me. Like I have a piece in the New York Times, and I write in the book about like how I bought a house during this time, like, right, or actually a little bit before the Obama presidency, thinking that was kind of a version of the American dream, right? And so I ended up actually selling that house recently and had been predatory lended, and it's a whole story. But for me, that was a real oversight of Barack Obama. I think that, people sometimes, and definitely the folks that I talked to, didn't always speak about Obama's policies. A couple of people mentioned, particularly immigration. He does have this tendency, I think, to what I think he thinks is like kind of keeping it real with Black folks, and sometimes can be, I think, a little. He talks down to them, which I do have problems with. I think that a lot of folks though give Obama a pass. I think I sometimes even tend to do that. I want to acknowledge, the problems of his administration. I want to acknowledge, the drones, Obamacare. Yeah, it's a little better, but it's still problematic health care.
Right.
It's not as aggressive. He's not aggressive. I think people give him a pass by saying, he did what he could do at the time. And I think that it would be different, perhaps, in the way that people engage with Obama and his legacy if we didn't have whatever we have in office now, which is
you can call it whatever you want.
Freaking problem. I don't even know what it is. So, I think in contrast that Obama, it can kind of look good. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
So I feel like that I think people wrap their heads around him in a different way because we've really swung to the right so much that I don't think people engage, and the people that I talk to, and just kind of thinking about the larger aspects of the American dream and opportunity, I didn't see people really engaging with Obama's legacy in that way. And then that's to say, we were talking about kind of large themes in American life. We're not having like heavy policy discussions.
Totally. But I mean, I guess that's so. Is it though? Like, okay, if like. So when you say it's like gone to shit and there's this reversion, I'm assuming that is like 90%, 99% Trump.
Some of it's Trump, but some of it, I think.
Or I mean, like Trump. Exemplified by him, I should say, not just him.
Absolutely exemplified by him. But I think gone to shit isn't just Trump, actually. Right. I think it is our society, like college tuition, should not be what it is. The decline of unions in this country is not all Donald Trump. You can blame some of it on him, but I think it's some of we have real structural problems that, certainly, weren't created by Trump or Obama that really radically need to be fixed and changed. Healthcare, for one. I mean, we talk so much about mental health in our book, which is so hard. It's not really addressed overall. I think by the industry, by folks. Obviously the shooting of Black men and women, and everyone else, and trans folks, and non-binary folks. That is something that I think we have not come to terms with and not figured out how to talk about as a society. The aggression of police departments, those things are problems, and we need to talk about that. There are deep systematic problems, right? So Trump can really, embody this kind of horrible, and kind of the worst and racist and, sexist and all these things. But I think that they're real systematic failures. And, I think that a lot of the young people in my book were savvy enough to realize that, it wasn't about one person or another. It was about a problem with our country.
And is this, and I'm like obviously editorializing, but is it possible then to like disentangle who Obama is, not even what he represents, who by all appearances he is just as a human being, right? Like a very appealing human being. And then the fact that these systems were not addressed, whether we're talking healthcare fundamentally or inequality or police murders or so on. And then of course we're in this Trump crisis, but like there is this continuity that you're saying that was not addressed, and somehow like having this great leader in this important moment, but also like, okay, like it didn't, at least on those other levels that are so historic and so beyond even obviously Obama or Trump, there's so much more to do. And, but on the other hand, like he didn't do it, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think people recognize that. Yeah. I think that they can kind of distinguish Obama, the man, for which I think there's some genuine admiration to, you know, Obama, the president, and Obama, the policymaker. And, you know, my focus was really talking about the symbol of Obama.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to take away, you know, the more troubling aspects, you know, and things that he didn't address. And I think what the Trump presidency really crystallized, and I think, you know, the Obama presidency to a degree, that there are deep structural problems. I mean, I think I think that there was probably a shift if I really think about the interviews and how they went. You know, 2008, I think people were in a different place than they were by 2012, right? Like, I think that hope that was there in 2008 when so many folks did come of age, by 2012, you know, obviously there was a difficult, there were obstacles in Congress, in, you know, the Supreme Court for Obama. But I think that as time wore on, as the Obama presidency wore on, people did realize that it's not about just this one man totally. It's about a system that is failing us. So I think when I talk to people, they were less likely to say, you know, Obama was at fault, but they'd be like pissed because like I didn't get my 40 acres and a mule. Like, right, they understood that like it was a problem that has continued and on and on and on for decades. But, you know, I also talked to some Trump supporters who wanted real change and thought that, you know, he could do that, and you know, who saw major problems with Obama, or people who just said, you know, I talked to a number of socialists who said, you know, it is like F them both, you know, like we need something new and different. And I feel like the trend overall was folks really wanting something different and something new, and not just in politics, but a different way of life. Everyone is stressed and tired and burnt out, and people feel like they have worked hard and they're working harder than ever. They have, like, you know, lots of folks have done things like getting solid jobs. They are, you know, or getting an education, doing all the quote unquote right things, and they're not seeing a payoff. So I think people are wondering what is the next thing, because this black president thing didn't necessarily mean that there was change.
Ilhan Omar, we got to change the Constitution, make her president.
I think people get it.
I would support. But as a final question, what do you think of music now in hip hop under Trump? Like, what is it, if you're you know, I don't want to assume what anybody's listening to at any given time, but like, what if you are, what do you think it's saying about now relative to the golden age?
Oh man, okay. So I am like actually terrible at listening to music now. I feel like all my music is
I hear you.
is stuck in the 90s and 2000s.
I hear
but
you.
You know, I'm not good. So I will give an answer. You know, I've listened to Beyonce like that. You know, I live in the Bronx, so there's a lot of Cardi B.
Right.
I listen to a lot of strong women. I think that you know, we're in an interesting place with music, where it feels, and I still am not sure how I'm feeling about this kind of, like Beyonce, for example, you know, is at the Super Bowl or a few years ago when, you know, kind of did this thing that pissed off the cops and had this Black Panther gear, and she, you know, recently in the Netflix special Homecoming, did a whole tribute to Black colleges. So I think that is wonderful. I think Cardi B being able to really kind of express herself and express her Afro-Latino roots and feel kind of this like real and authentic persona are kind of wonderful, wonderful things. I mean, but, you know, I think they still kind of espouse the American dream story, but they're doing it, which I think America just kind of keeps on navigating to, and some of it's about materialism, but, you know, particularly I think with Beyonce and Cardi too, I think has, at least from the racial angle, really I think embraced Black womanhood, which I think is kind of amazing, and done so in a way that I think shows different shades and different sides. Like Cardi is very different from Beyonce, and kind of, also I think really espousing a feminist ideology that was missing before. So I think that as a Black woman, I'm feeling good. Like, I feel like it's, there's some powerful things, I still want there to be, I think I keep looking for this kind of like 60s era, like music movement, that's like pushing back against Trump, and it's just not there. And I don't, I'm not sure why that is yet, but it does feel like that's missing in a way, right? Beyonce is very commercial and independent artist that I would love people to tell me about that I'm not so savvy to, but I want to see in a commercial space as well. I want to see more kind of artists pushing back against, and speaking out politically. Like, I really feel like that critique is missing a bit.
Yeah. It is interesting when you have elements of like literal electoral political culture, like a Bernie Sanders, and some like being ahead of certain parts of like culture, right, is very odd in terms of just kind of like, you go and you hear like him literally ranting about the military-industrial complex in Brooklyn. It's like, interesting, and awesome. But that is interesting. I wonder why there isn't that type of thing.
Yeah, culture has culture in some ways, and right, like even you're talking about someone like a Cardi B. I mean, that's like really, I think their persona is really about materialism a lot as well. And I kind of just miss some more kind of like grassroots. I want to say like most stuff, or or even like I don't know.
Did NDIRE had a moment like that? I feel like I don't even remember what years that was though.
Yeah, that was like, that was in the early 2000s, 90s. Yeah, that's
okay.
The neo soul. That's kind
ago.
of what I grew up on.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
that's kind of, I feel like that's kind of missing. But at the same time, like for me, I'm looking at the idea of like this quote unquote American dream, or some people would say American nightmare, and that's I think that kind of Horatio Alger, rags to riches, those stories people still continue to love them. It's so bizarre because, like, America is, in general, has never been a society where social mobility, and being able to move up is actually a thing for most people. But we're so tied to this. It is really astounding to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird studies on that, like other countries believing it less but having more of it and all of that. It's such a good book. I really hope everybody will read it. It was all a dream. A new generation confronts the broken promise to Black America. Reniqua Allen, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on the show. Thanks,
okay.
Michael.
Take care. All right, folks. We've got 2 quick segments to get to, and then Ben Burgis is going to logify the room with logic. Yes, we love Cardi. I mean, I'm always Team Cardi. I also don't.
Hashtag defend Cardi.
Hashtag always defend Cardi. I mean, and also like, yeah, no, I think it's interesting though. It's I don't know how to explain how Cardi does the materialism thing. There is something slightly different about it. And it might just be because she's like the authentic is a very overused word. And in some ways, an overrated attribute, frankly. I feel like Zizek, like most people should be less authentic because them being authentic is annoying. But that being said, like she really, in a way that not many, I mean, I could think of a couple of others, but there's something about it's so non-put on, and she makes you comfortable by how totally comfortable she is in herself. And obviously she's incredibly charismatic and everything, but I think there's something to that.
I mean, a big part of it is that she just clearly put the time in and she knows what she's talking about.
Oh, when you're talking, I'm talking just generally. When she talks about politics, I mean, yes, that's a huge standout to me.
Like, that's the thing
That's
is-
a major standout. Her political sophistication.
Like, if you get over that she's saying it in a Bronx accent, it's like, oh, she's actually familiar with like Eleanor Roosevelt, right?
Right.
Like she, and I think that's why the right has a tough time, and why she's sort of a target. They think they can get her because they think she's sort of like very shallow. With
well, because
all
they're
this
just
stuff.
classist.
Exactly. And
That's
classist
really
and
all it
racist,
is. Yeah,
right?
they're just on class and race shit.
So they assume
can't-
that she's actually like
Right.
only surface level, but she actually goes deep with this stuff.
Totally. I was thinking even on a level of like her, like Yellow with Offset. But yes, she is politically sophisticated. Before we get a strike, Jesus Christ. All right, Griscom, go ahead. The gem. What do we got?
So I'm pretty excited about this. I'm sure folks have seen the news, but tomorrow there is going to be a massive strike in the rideshare app industry. This actually is very likely to be the largest ever tech/gig worker strike that we've seen, especially in recent years after this massive strike drought. And people are organizing primarily around three specific demands, which is, fighting against low pay and debt that a lot of these drivers face, to win security for the workers, because Uber, even though they say that these people aren't employees and they can't be, fired or whatever, they deactivate people's apps, and then they're basically can't make any money, and there's no recourse for them, and certainly, to secure a livable income for folks. And not only is this strike desperately needed, but it's very strategic in its moment, because Friday, Uber is releasing its IPO, which, as I've read recently, is looking like it's going to be a $91 billion valuation. And not only is it significant because of that, but we're really looking at this question is, when Uber goes public, what's going to happen to drivers? And within their S1 filing, Uber admitted that they've been lowering fares for drivers, and that they're very likely that they're going to need to do more in the future. They were $1 billion in losses in the first quarter of last year. So as you have more and more investors who are demanding more and more profit, it's very likely that workers are going to see, more decline in their paycheck. So having the show of force right now is absolutely massive, especially mobilizing a bunch of workers. We've talked about our atomized, there's no water cooler, there's not a space where people are spending time together. So trying to get that organizing work is absolutely, is very difficult, but it, has the potential to be really serious. Just in New York City, the New York Taxi Worker Alliance says there's likely to be 10,000 drivers who are going to be logging off the apps tomorrow. So the results could be very significant. There's 3 million drivers worldwide for Uber, and from what we've been reading, what I've been seeing recently, this protest has actually moved outside the United States, and there actually are going to be international, solidarity with people logging off of the apps as well. So we could see a very significant shift here. And, we have to remember, for example, that, Uber workers, EPI did an analysis, really on average, even though Uber likes to say, these people are making $19 to $24 an hour. When you're talking about how much they're paying, for gas and all these other expenses, including paying their own Social Security and payroll taxes, that most workers are coming off with only around $9.21 an hour. So people are very much being paid in poverty wages for one of the more not profitable, but for one of the highest valued companies in the world.
Yes.
So Uber and
That
Lyft
is causing a lot of extra pollution in the air.
Absolutely,
Yes.
and
And
especially
traffic
because people
deaths
and
and
traffic
deaths,
and people are
yes.
sitting around idling in their car. But
Yes.
Uber and Lyft, they blew up after one of the greatest recessions in modern history. And what did they do? They had a lot of workers who were very desperate for cash. And Uber especially has one of the highest worker turnover rates. Most people who drive for Uber are really only doing it for 2 months. And it's not because these people are desperate and don't need cash. It's because they're so desperate and need cash that they're doing it in the first place, and they realize how quickly it becomes a bad deal. Because up front, you get a lot of incentives from the company to drive, and those start to become more and more difficult to obtain. So as people are going forward, they end up making less and less money. So instead of trying to work to retain their workers, Uber's business model has basically been predicated on a model where you extract as much as you can from people, spend them, and then replace them. So this replacement model is absolutely not viable for workers, and it's important for them to be standing up. And you see, this is why Uber has been so focused on creating self-driving cars, because they don't want to have workers to pay in the first place. But at the end of the day, they won't have a viable service if it's not for the drivers. So because they've had all these drivers who are moving in and out of the app, there's less incentive for people to stand up and fight. They just move on. So trying to organize people like they're doing tomorrow is absolutely the best way forward, because we're seeing so many people in this country are going through in and out of Uber and a lot of these other gig services and leaving and not creating better circumstances for everyone by standing up. And there's so many people who are really affected by Uber's policies. I just want to shout out Lee Carter in Virginia, who said that he drives for Uber and he's going to be going on strike tomorrow. He's the delegate in the 50th district in Virginia, a really incredible person, and so many other stories of wonderful people who are really, just trying to get by and trying to make a little bit of extra cash and are really being exploited by a company that makes massive profits, has been able to skirt basic worker regulations by, bullshit classification on what their employees are and by considering them not to be employees, and by a government that very much has allowed this to happen. So absolutely solidarity with all workers, all workers in general, but especially tomorrow with all rideshare workers, and hopefully we'll see a big showing tomorrow.
Fuck rideshare companies.
Yeah,
they're a terrible, pernicious influence on the environment, workers, and basically everything else. And public transportation, which we need to survive as a species.
And just
literally,
real quick before this comes on my mind, let's not forget how horrible Uber and Lyft were a couple years ago when they were creating very predatory lending services to their workers. So they were trying to get people who needed to have a car. They were giving them financing, and it's really bad financing for people. And that program has ended now. But it just shows the way that they treat people as so expendable and trying to profit basically off of their employees. I'm absolutely wicked.
Well, and you sort of touched on some of this, David, but basically, like, neither of these companies is profitable, right, at this point. And the thesis for their IPO is that automation, or basically their market share plus automation, will lead to their business model eventually being profitable at some point.
That's definitely a part of it, and also just continual growth. So the idea is that since Uber is growing so much year in and year out, that even though that they are funding a loss, they're funding it through investors, so people who are in early can cash out. And basically, what's happened now is you have all these private investors who are in early. They don't want to support them anymore, so that's why they go public. It's basically to get a new group of people. But the problem is, these public investors are going to be much more hungry for profit. So yeah, you're going to see squeezing. And I mean, Uber up until the end of last year, after those accidents where they're self-driving cars, they were spending $20 million a month to try to develop this technology.
They bought the entire robotics department at, is it Carnegie Mellon maybe, or some sort of Pennsylvania base?
It was in Pittsburgh, and that's why if you were in Pittsburgh, they were testing them there pretty heavily.
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus Christ.
It was supposed to be like, we're going to do partnerships with Carnegie Mellon's robotics, and it's like, we're just going to own these guys and make them try to
and with the city government of Pittsburgh, so you can see how they're able to get into those areas.
I heard some stories recently from frankly victims of this about how even like the position of these rideshare apps at the Newark airport, like basically positioned in such a way that protected like drivers, and then maybe there was some money that might have gone around local Newark politics that local and state politics that might have shifted those arrangements.
Newark? Can that do that in Newark politics?
Yeah. What a shock.
Does money have an effect on?
No. I mean, I'm sure it was
those guys.
I'm sure it was just ideas. All right. We need to do a little bit of a segment here. Then Ben will come on with us. But we're going to be doing more and more coverage of Iran. I will say for patrons, we have several illicit histories that are focused on Iran. But there is no doubt that Mike Pompeo and John Bolton are attempting a military conflict with Iran. And we need to review the basic timeline here. There's a lot more to get into, and this relationship between Iran and the United States, Iran, the Middle East, even the fact that, and this is totally without excusing, I always have to say this because some people are not able to think through several things at once. The Iranian government absolutely is violating of rights, as an example of women's advocates, the Baha'is, there's no doubt. There's also no doubt that even the Iranian Revolution, which in some ways is a pretty fascinating revolution that actually tried to sort of be indigenous oriented. Its constitution says neither east nor west, as in not to be a client of either, the United States or the Soviet Union, to track an independent revolutionary track, right? So, and the left very early on was marginalized in Iran, but there was a significant left component, including left Islamist component of the revolution. And you still see it in Rouhani to some extent, obviously, Javad Zarif. These are not leftists, but moderates, extremely sophisticated global operators. And then also people like Khatami and Mousavi, who are actually really something approaching Islamic liberals who were sidelined and oppressed because they frankly spoke out in things like the Green Movement. But I have to say, relative to what was happening, the Iranian main enemy of the United States put all this energy on Iran in the 80s and the 90s and to today. But the Iranian government, even at its worst, actually also had a serious and robust ideas opposed to imperialism and colonialism. The United States was more interested in teaming up with the Saudis to fund one-dimensional religious activists with no politics other than religious purity. And that's a significant historical distinction. And it's a historical distinction that leads to the fact that Obama and partners, J5+1, were able to create this extraordinary deal with Iran. And we can question the merits of, even the intelligence to begin with, frankly. The nature of Iran's nuclear program was one of great ambiguity. And U.S. intelligence estimates consistently undermined the alarmism of the establishment, the media, and the Israelis and the Saudis. Under Trump, he's pulled out of the deal, which is a disaster. And he might just be pulling out of it because he's a baby and he doesn't want to re-sign Obama's deal. But Bolton and Pompeo are extremists. Bolton has taken money from the MEK, an extremist splinter group, which fought on the side of Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. That same war that the Iraqis were using chemical weapons on the Iranians and the United States was selling Iraq weapons. You got to remember these things. This report from friend of show Mike Hanna is also really important because for people who remember, and he'll mention in this clip, Trump's first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia. And it wasn't a signal that he got that he was going to not need to be Islamophobic in office, obviously, because there's plenty. But it was a signal that literally this is going to be almost a bilateral central relationship to how the United States does business. And there might be only one country besides Israel that has been more dangerous and bloodthirsty relative to Iran, and that would be the Saudis.
It was a surprise to many when President Trump chose Riyadh as a destination of his first international trip in office. But 2 years on, it's clear this was more of a signal as to the central role Saudi Arabia would play in his administration's decision-making.
So that's key to this. And you still have MBS in power. You still have MBS waging the Saudis with U.S. and UK support, Emirati engagement, waging a genocidal campaign in Yemen. That's still happening despite the efforts of Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna and the international community. So with this new blockade in the Straits of Hormuz, you have a position where on one hand you have an Iranian foreign ministry desperately trying to save a successful international agreement, while the United States squeezes Europe with threats and squeezes China with financial consequences and is provocative in every way, shape, or form, including designating the Quds Force as a terrorist organization. To the point that, as a former CIA analyst, I believe Paul Pillar is his name, was saying that basically the strategy is to provoke enough that if Iran makes one misstep, that will be the justification for war. So you have an Iraq/Gulf of Tonkin sort of scenario in front of you right now, even as the United States is consistently rebuffed from coup-mongering in Venezuela. And, I would suggest, again, it seems so ridiculous. Of course, protest, of course, energetically even push back against propaganda from like CNN national security reporters you'll see on Twitter. But this does have to become central in the Democratic primary. I will say Bernie Sanders, the only member of the United States Senate, along with Rand Paul, who voted against Iran sanctions that undermine this deal. Elizabeth Warren voted for it. Kamala Harris voted for it. All of the other people running voted for it. Bernie Sanders voted against it. They need to rejoin the deal, and they need to push back against what would be maybe one of the most catastrophic things that could happen on the planet right now.
We should make a point that those Iran deal sanctions were in a bill with the Russia sanctions. And every time you see somebody on Twitter, for instance, I get this a lot, like, why did Bernie vote against Russia sanctions? Well, he was voting against the Iran sanctions.
And you know what? I would double up, because those people might be people that pretend to. I would say, yeah, he was voting to protect President Obama's core foreign policy achievement, which was undermined by this scumbag white supremacist baby. So Bernie was fighting for a deal that Obama achieved and was willing to sacrifice, let's be real here, some pretty symbolic and relatively trivial sanctions against Russia, which frankly don't matter one way or another.
I'm more Obama bot than you are.
Yeah. Who's the real Obama bot, motherfucker?
But the thing is, too, is like we also can't take these people like Bolton at face value, because definitely because they want to destroy Iran. When he talks about Iran, he doesn't care about the people there. He's not fighting for anyone's freedom. It's not, and it's also, yes, part of it's appeasing the Saudis, but it's also the fact that there is a powerful state that doesn't toe the United States line in the area, and they want to destroy it because of that.
Definitely.
And regarding so they'll use any story or any narrative that they want, and it's very important that we watch this Russia stuff, because as we saw what was going on in Venezuela, they'll cynically use this kind of thing that a lot of people have worked themselves up to, to further their own imperialist goals. They don't care what the backstory is, because what they really want to do is they want to destroy Iran, and they want to make it into a client state of the United States, just like they do in Venezuela, and they don't care about the overarching narratives, and they'll construct anyone. So we really need to not only be paying attention, but be out there trying to tell the truth as much as possible, because we can't allow this kind of thing to be something on the back burner and allow them to get away with this, because it's absolute nonsense. It's horrific.
That's absolutely right. And as Hannah's pointed out in that report as well, Trump has also recently flipped and is starting to back the Saudis in Libya against the internationally recognized transition authority there. Now, again, I'm not a defender of that group, but that is a pretty significant geopolitical break to support yet another area where the Saudis are engaging in reckless expansionism. Okay, we're going to take a brief break, and then Ben Burgis is going to get up here. We're going to talk about Marx, Hegel, and a little thing called logic. Got any? No, I'm just kidding. All right.
Hello.
Yeah, so anyways, I just think the guy's a fucking idiot. But oh shit, we're back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is the great Ben Burgis. He's a regular. He's the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and he teaches, logic and logic-like things at Rutgers University. I grew up really hating Rutgers because they played UMass Amherst in basketball.
Yeah.
And I was a big UMass fan. Coach Calipari, Marcus Camby, and Lou Rowe. And, yeah. That's about the extent of that anecdote, buddy.
Okay, well,
move off of it a little bit.
Good story.
Jesus.
Good story.
Yeah. Work with me.
I do. Well,
it's a little thing in improv called "Say Yes, Ben."
Okay,
like
sorry.
when you go like, "There's a thought experiment called," and I'm just like, "Oh wow!" Versus like, "Jesus fucking Christ." Come on, work with me, brother.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was just a really boring story, but but I mean, I don't really mind that.
That's an ad hom.
The hate Rutgers part. I think that. I certainly hate the Rutgers administration.
Tell us about it. How freely can you speak on how horrible they are?
I just want to. You mentioned the ad hom thing there, and you can get back to the records thing. But I want to, since we have Ben in studio here,
Yes,
I wanted
please.
to ask you about ad hominems in general, because I'm a fan of ad hominems. I like sprinkling them.
Yeah, like when you say like, "Eat shit," Brad Thornburg, state
Exactly.
rep from the 3rd district in Minnesota.
And my point is the logic of my argument is not affected that I might do because I might do an ad hominem elsewhere in the argument. So like I have a logical argument here. I'm choosing to tack on the ad hominem just as sort of style.
Right.
But my problem is conservatives can only react to the fact that there was an ad hominem. They can't actually do the logic computer thing, which is that let's disregard the ad hominem. Let's move right to the logic of your underlying argument. They have to take offense to the ad hominem.
Yeah, so this is actually, I've got some good news for you. what you're doing is not committing the ad hominem fallacy.
Yes.
Oh shit.
This is
Wait a
this
second.
is
Matt, come on.
this is something that,
Shofar. He's not committing the ad hominem fallacy.
no, this is something I talk about all the time. I have a video for Zero. It's called like ad hominems, Chapo Trap House, and something. I don't remember what Doug called it, but and in there, talk about this, that saying something mean before or after addressing somebody's argument isn't committing an ad hominem fallacy any more than you're committing appeal to authority if you say something nice, before like endorsing somebody's argument. You can like this is actually, I think one of the most liberating things that I can tell people about logic, that being an asshole is not a logical fallacy. Go for it.
Awesome.
As far as Rutgers goes, though, I am pretty happy.
Very good news in the first block of this segment.
Yeah, if you get one thing out of this episode, you can,
Yeah, people definitely need more of that encouragement.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, yeah, I did see there was a court case recently where a judge ruled that it's okay to refer to your boss as a nasty motherfucker if it's done in the course of a labor dispute, that's protected.
Thank God.
So speaking of labor disputes, Rutgers,
nasty guy.
Rutgers
Nasty fucker.
Rutgers administration is pretty awful, and I was thinking about that during the Griscom Economic Minute, because he was talking about Uber. And of course, Uber represents what global capitalism is becoming for everybody, even academics.
Right.
So a great deal of the people who work at Rutgers, and I have been one of them in this group. I'm actually starting a full-time job elsewhere in a couple months, so which is one of the reasons I feel free to speak quite this freely.
Right.
But are part-time lecturers, which means that oftentimes they have the same qualifications as people who have full-time NTT or even tenure-track positions. They teach a increasingly large percentage of classes. They often teach over the course of a year at least as many classes as people who are officially classified as full-time. But there's no meaningful job security semester to semester. And there's no health care, right? You have to buy the crappy health care from the Obamacare exchange.
Right.
And what my union local has been demanding is proportional pay, right? So in other words, that you should be paid as much relative to how many credits you're teaching as a full-time non-tenure track lecturer would be paid, which would be a huge pay raise. And right now, but it would be a huge pay raise because right now people are being paid nothing.
Right.
But to put this in perspective, to give part-time lectures at Rutgers absolutely everything being demanded right now, which is $72.50 per class and healthcare, the estimated total costs are about $3 million, which sounds like a lot of money.
No, it does not.
Until you realize that Rutgers just gave a bunch of the sort of top administrators almost $6 million in incentive bonuses because they all think they did such a good job.
Right. Nothing surprising. I mean, the only surprise to me is that it's double versus, versus I don't know, even tenths more, or not tenth, whatever more than double is.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
which is a big, along with the decline of state funding, of course, this is a big part of the problem that's causing this problem is because there are all these administrators who come out of the corporate world and they all think they're indispensable, so they all, they all keep on hiring more of themselves, and it just metastasizes into this massive bureaucracy of, vice presidents for overlapping functions and things like that.
Right. It's obscene. And that every lane of the economy has its Uberization lane.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously adjuncts are the Uberization lane of academia. And I'm not trying to pick in fact, I really like Thaddeus Russell, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with him at all, but it's interesting because part of his answer to dissatisfaction with academia, which I get, like I understand the impulse, like fuck it, let me get out and start my own thing. I mean, that's cool. But on the other hand, it's like, do you really want a scenario where you get rid of like what little vestiges of this whole process, remain? Because people are going to be totally fucked that way. And there's also not going to be any room to breathe. I mean, Mark Fisher actually wrote really effectively about this, about how just like, you can't morally lecture people on like not reading and thinking and taking on ideas anymore when it's in a very narrow sense a foolish thing to do. It's like impossible. It's like what do you mean you're gonna go get? I mean, my degree, I was lucky. I mean, I'm certainly in student debt. They gave me a relatively good deal because I was completely broke, and Bates is like a top 25 liberal arts school, so it's like, okay, there's situations where I probably was like, oh, all right, like that's a good school. But then there's another way in which it's like, it did objectively help me for all the things that I've done. And on the other hand, is just completely market unjustifiable.
Which
to
should
go
be
several years and learn how to like read and think, which every single human being should do for completely its own ends, completely its own purpose. By the way, there's another problem with Andrew Yang and why you need to decommodify education.
Totally. And like we should even be honest about this, because I think an objection somebody might make to like Bernie's free college plan, or that they, maybe like would make if they thought about it more, is that to whatever extent, college education might still, open up some kind of pathway to, higher income bracket. That's less true the more people have it, right?
Right.
There's supply and demand in the labor market. So,
Right.
which is why it's asinine to tell people to just learn to code, because the more people who learn to code, the less the market value of that skill. In fact, if we got what we wanted and everybody could go to college, then there would even be less market value even than there is right now. But that's okay, right? That's not why we want it, right? We don't want it in order to enable some people to rise above the economic level of everybody else, to allow more people to do that. We want to raise the floor economically for everybody. And then we also want everybody to have basic human goods like learning to read and think in the way you're talking about.
Precisely. Let's actually, I think this, because we don't have too much time left in the main show, but we are going to touch a bit on Marx and Hegel. But I do think that this actually is a good way to transition to your second piece in Quillette.
Yeah, so actually
you published two pieces in Quillette.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, I'm a huge critic of many things Quillette.
Yes.
But
as
we all are, if Quillette, and I think this is a smart brand move if this is what they're trying to do. One of the knocks about the IDW, and I don't want to get into a whole IDW thing right now because as I write this book, I'm getting pretty fucking exhausted that I'm going to have to keep talking about them. But there is a market, I think, for people that actually lived up to that rhetoric. I think that there is some genuine, I really want to engage in controversial whatever thinking. Some good, some bad, blah, blah, blah. And if Quillette is going to start publishing legitimate pieces on Marxism by you and others, I think it's okay, that's an interest that they're gonna create. That's an open market right there.
Yeah, I would agree. I just want to put this on record because I am elsewhere on the record in Politico as if you say with contributors labeled everything from clowns to crypto fascists. If you click through the crypto fascists, you'll know this es mio. And I agree, but I totally agree with what Michael's saying. I think if the way that they've been going at Dave Rubin, just labeling him as sort of accurately
stuff,
well, it's smart branding. I think that it's a combination. I think there's three things that I've noticed with Quillette, right? Because they got their start, and my opinion would also be crypto fascist. And then they sort of moved to occasionally doing I don't know, maybe this is a valid critique of a problem on the left, but I have plenty of problems with the left, but I wouldn't talk about them in Quillette.
Yeah.
I would only talk about them in a left-wing outlet, right? But then So, but that's still within the realm completely of essentially like right-wing complaint politics, or can't talk about anything anymore politics.
Right.
But when they start, but then they did those two moves within like a week where they had two of your pieces, and then they just had some guy basically just come forward and be like, Dave Rubin is maybe not exactly on the up and up, claiming not to be like a far right, and of course Dave was, he's totally unfair, he's totally mean, and it had a big meltdown. But I think that, the smarter people in that category, and I mean, and this is my speculation for purely cynical reasons, they recognize that they need to do some brand decontamination with Dave, because it's just too transparent.
Yeah.
It's too goofy, So, but what was the second piece? It was first was why the IDW can't read Marx, which I recommend everybody read, and then the second was everybody values freedom.
Yeah, so they're actually published in the other order, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, my bad.
And the one that we talked about a little bit before was called Marx Needs Better Critics,
Right.
and is about Jordan Peterson's basically confession of ignorance about Marx in his debate with Slavoj Žižek,
Right.
That we talked about last week. And then the one, Why Everyone Values Freedom, which is co-written with Matt McManus, who is, like both of us, a author for Zero Books. He has a book coming out on postmodern conservatism, basically about conservatives being much more like the postmodernists they like to bash than they would like to admit.
Yes.
And in it, in this article, Why Everyone Values Freedom, we talk about how the right, which is often far more than we should allow it to, sort of monopolize freedom talk, basically has an understanding of freedom in terms of non-interference, with a particular emphasis on non-interference in markets. But there is this long and rich alternate way of thinking about freedom, going back to the ancient Roman Republic, which is freedom as non-domination. And this is certainly the tradition that Marx was in. Marx uses a lot of neo-Roman vocabulary, talks about wage slaves, a temporary dictatorship, the proletariat. These were all Roman concepts. And the non-domination tradition says what matters isn't necessarily how much you're being interfered with as you attempt to do something. That might, of course, matter, but the underlying thing is how vulnerable you are to dominate, to involuntary domination by others. And so, of course, Marx's...
I don't really like to talk about people. I like to talk about ideas.
I don't know if it's just that every time I see Dave Rubin now, I hear your Dave Rubin in my head. I'm sure.
Well, he's impersonating me.
I'm sure that's part of it.
Yeah.
But it's just something about the way he stares at the camera and blinks. He's just like the emptiest vessel that has ever been put in front of a camera. It's
Bolsonaro.
I think some people have been listening to this, though, and this is interesting. We played a couple weeks ago on the show a great Bernie ad on why Medicare for All is about, also among many other things, obviously, including just basic ethics, but also about freedom. Bhaskar Sunkara, who is a regular on this show, founder of the Jackman, one of the most important people in establishing any type of socialist thought in this country. His new book is excellent. I'm actually in the middle of, you know what, Matt? I'm literally in the middle of listening to it on Audible.
Wait,
the Socialist
that's
Manifesto.
on Audible already?
Bhaskar Sunkara, the Socialist Manifesto. It's on
Wow.
Audible. So go buy it or download it. Bhaskar is amazing.
I actually bought an old-fashioned Dead Tree version. I've been reading that.
It's a great book.
Well, the good thing to know about you when you say Dead Tree is that I feel like the paper industry is actually what do they call it? Sustainable at this point. So you don't feel bad about that. But I am going to get the Audible version and probably read it. I'm not going to say by the next episode, but by the next episode.
You will be listening to it by the next episode.
Excited for that.
Bhaskar is on the come up, and just as obviously our friend and crew, Bree Joy Gray, who everybody should subscribe, by the way, to the Listen to Burn podcast. She's doing a great job with that, or hear the Burn podcast. She's doing a great job with that. Bhaskar cut this ad for Bernie's campaign, and I think it actually echoes your article.
We know how important it is to defeat Trump in 2020, but I'm afraid that after Trump, a right populism
might exist in the U.S. for a long time to come. Sanders gives us the opportunity not just win one election, but to create the vast progressive majority that can win election after election. This isn't a 4-year project. This is an 8-year project. This is a project to remake America and remake American politics for the next 10, 15, 20 years. For decades, working people in the United States have been told over and over again that it's their fault. You lost your job, it's your fault. Maybe you should reformat your CV. Maybe you should take a coding class. You're drifting deeper and deeper in medical debt. It's your fault. Maybe you should have seen the doctor more. Maybe you should start doing yoga, exercising a bit more. All these messages have been telling people that the problems of society were individual failings. That's why I was so inspired by the Sanders campaign, because in 2016, and again now, millions of people are realizing that it's not their fault. In fact, they should be expecting and demanding more, and that collectively, we could fight for things like Medicare for all. We could fight for things like a safe and sustainable environmental policy to keep the planet going for our future generations. What we need is a return to shared prosperity and justice for all people. That's why I'm supporting Bernie Sanders.
Bhaskar fucking crushing it for Bernie, but I think also echoing your points.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Bhaskar has been a big influence over the last few years in how I think about these issues, because this is a kind of framing that I've seen him use very often in Jacobin and elsewhere, which, of course, you can make the argument in the sort of more radical way that Marx makes it, or you can make it in a more small-scale social democratic way, but the core of the argument is the same, which is that if you're interested in freedom as freedom from domination, which I think is the kind of freedom, is the kind of personal autonomy that most human beings really care about, right? That like whether you can trace your property back to a just act of original acquisition isn't something that most human beings have any reason to be particularly interested in. Unless
you are an inherited, like you're a baron.
Yes, exactly.
You don't want to pay for kids' dental insurance. That might concern you.
Exactly. But for most non-barons, the question is, am I controlling in a meaningful, in-practice way how I live my life? Or is somebody else in a position to call those shots for me? Whether that's, do I feel like I can join a union, or am I worried that I'm going to get fired? Am I having to do everything my boss says, or do I feel free to say no? And one, of course, this is the problem with capitalism. This is Marx's point that most people realistically have no choice except for to submit to domination by a boss, because you can try starting your own business, but it's hard to get together the starter capital. Most small businesses fail in the first year. So realistically, most people have to do that. And so for 8 out of every 16 hours you're awake, you're taking orders from your boss. And even within capitalism, there are degrees of freedom. That this is that if you express a political opinion that your boss doesn't like, how worried are you about getting fired? If you get a tattoo, how worried are you that your boss will fire you for doing that? And one of the things that really chains us to our jobs in the United States, for most people who can get this for their jobs, is health insurance. Everybody is terrified all the time that if they lose their job, if they have to switch jobs, then they'll lose their health insurance. And so that's why, I know an ad that you played in a previous episode that, the Bernie campaign did is called Medicare for All is about freedom. Right. And that's how Bad and I start the article. Say, hey, the Bernie Sanders campaign put out this ad, Medicare for All is about freedom, which I think whoever put that ad out has been listening to Bhaskar for the last few years, because this is an ad this is an argument he makes all the time. And that, how does that work, right? What's the way of thinking about freedom here? And we go through the history. We talk about Marx. We talk about how Medicare for all, there's other social democratic reforms make people more free in practice. And I noticed even in the Quillette comment section, which, as I've had a couple of chances to experience at this time is not the most friendly environment, for left-wing arguments. There is a lot of...
They're crypto-fascists.
There is a
Just
lot...
kidding. Sorry for the ad hom.
there is a lot of, oh my God, why did they publish this? That's not...
I can't believe.
What is this guy's IQ?
Yeah.
He teaches logic, but his IQ clearly cannot be more than a 96.
Yeah, there's a lot of skull measuring. But even there... even if you have some backwards views about, gender naming and SJWs and stuff, everybody's terrified about this healthcare thing. Everybody lives in fear of losing their healthcare. Even there was some positive responses
I
to that
always will
argument.
quote, Jamila Michener, please listen to the illicit history of Medicaid, and we're going to have her on the main show. But unless you're Jeff Bezos, this healthcare system is a threat to you. So it's a mass danger, and to obviously if you're middle class, if you're poor, if you're working class, of course. But she has ethnographic studies in her book of people who might even be clearing $1 million a year, who had a kid born with the wrong decision, with the wrong, diagnosis. Their life is turned upside down. This system. Private insurance is a structural threat to anybody that isn't a oligarch.
Absolutely.
Right? It is not you are. This is absolutely 1%, 99% issue. And in fact, it might even be a 0.2% verse issue.
I listened to that illicit history. I liked it a lot. And one of the most interesting points that she made at one point in there, which goes to the point about freedom, is that, there's a point where in your discussion, you said, well, hold on. Even for the oligarch's perspective, right, this is a major business expense.
Right.
Why don't they just want to offload it onto government the way that big business offloads all kinds of expenses, for their onto government, right? That's half of what Rutgers does. It's free R&D for corporations.
Right.
And, she mentioned some reasons, right, but part of it is exactly this, that people kind of know that the workforce is going to be more compliant.
Absolutely.
Right? If people are relying on their bosses for their health care.
100%. All right. I want to give people some Hegel and Marx.
Yeah.
So, because actually we do. I think we do have a fair amount of people, as an example, might be in students. They might be taking this stuff or just come across on YouTube. People are interested in ideas.
Yeah.
And they should have an opportunity to learn good ideas. But let's center it.
Yeah.
I think the idea of dialectics is actually one of the most exciting, illustrative, and it teaches. So even when I, as an example, object to moralism or tell people that you need to deal with complexity and have infinitely more sort of nuance, forgiveness, and compassion for fellow human beings, let alone people you're in political struggle with. And then at the same time, I also am people on the left need to learn how to be absolutely ruthless, serious about power, and truly crushing people, right? Who need to be in a sense of political opposition to people who hold and wield actual power. That in a way is dialectical in the sense that, and I think David Harvey was the first person who articulated this that I heard that made sense to me, is that it's a way of thinking that is not directional and linear, it's interactive and dynamic. You're, instead of looking for first principles or one roadmap for everything, you're looking at the dynamism, the interplay. That's why it's such a great tool for even for international relations. What's happening with Iran? You have this drive from Bolton. You have China calibrating. You have all of these different principles, even in conflict, like opposing U.S. imperialism, but also having solidarity with people that maybe we're aligned with who oppose a government in Iran or Venezuela. These are all happening. Dialectics is the best, in my view, methodology for handling these contradictions in a way that doesn't just, devolve to the other extreme, which is hey, it's all just, hey, it's fucking complicated, bro. So what is dialectics from Hegel to Marx? What is that idea? And what is the, what's the distinction between a Hegelian and Marxist dialectic?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about what Hegel's doing is that Hegel has the opposite view of Sam Harris, who holds that history, and I quote, is completely irrelevant.
That is by the way, teaser for my book. The title of the Sam Harris chapter is Totally Irrelevant. or if I may ad hom for a minute, as Sam Harris said to Ezra Klein in the debate, the history here is completely irrelevant.
All of a sudden, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore.
God, and people still ask me, like, do you think he's a toxic influence on culture? He only promotes really simplistic sophomore year philosophy and promotes all sorts of horrible ideas.
Scientific data can't be racist.
Yeah.
Okay, what would Hegel say about that?
Well, Hegel actually has...
Oh, I love that you gave that a real, like, actually.
Has one of the few things that's not committing the ad hominem fallacy. We went over this. That's not what it means. But the kind of thing that, like, people on Twitter would refer to as an ad hom. Hegel actually has a great ad hom about phrenology. About how, like, people who think that, like, the mind and spirit is, like, importantly, and out in skull shape, that, like, we should test this by cracking their skulls. That's I'm not making that up. It's a phenomenology of spirit.
That's the perfect phrenology joke.
That is an amazing. Wow. And my stereotype is that Germans aren't funny. He's not even Jewish German. It's impressive.
Yeah. So Hegel has this view about historical progress towards freedom. So in Hegel's case, Hegel is an idealist, which is to say that he thinks that ideas are primary in a certain kind of way, and that this progress he sees through history, he's got this conception of the world spirit, which is this kind of, like, mystical, quasi-religious idea of, like, this sort of what's animated civilizations, to progress and have certain kinds of national character. But the through line of progress that he sees is about freedom from the struggle with nature. So that humans can subjugate nature to their own ends, which already, by the way, the world spirit part doesn't sound very Marxist, but that last part does sound Marxist,
right?
And that's going to be a point of connection. So, but as far as dialectical methodology, Hegel knows, as he's offering this analysis of all of human history, basically, that to make this work, given this just astounding array of evidence that all these different cultures and societies at different times, any kind of, like, rigid this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, very, like, straightforward story just isn't going to fit the data. Which leads him to have this dialectical analysis. Of course, it's not that dialectics starts with Hegel exactly. He's coming out of stuff from previous thinkers going back to Aristotle, but he's putting the ideas together in a particular way. And Hegel thinks that you have to look at systems both as a whole, so you can see these points where there are these opposed tendencies that are pushing things in various directions, so you can see where the potential developments from there might be.
And is it also the notion too that in some ways you can understand a thing through its contradiction?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and that's where the being able to deal with that is very important.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the origin of Zizek's jealous husband joke too.
Yes.
Right. Like even the obsessively jealous husband. Whether or not his wife is cheating on him is totally secondary to the function of jealousy. And you can't understand that without that position in place.
It's like Trotsky there's a really good Trotsky text on this, actually, the ABCs of dialectical materialism. And he has this line where he says, just like you can, envision a pound of sugar, but a pound of sugar that's covered in water is completely different than a pound of sugar that's covered in kerosene. Right? So the idea that these things are changing in the context of where they are actually.
Yeah,
Right.
And in that article, part of what Trotsky's talking about is, we say a pound of sugar. Well, it's never that there's any exact point where it's exactly a pound, right? That it's like 1 grain, more or less, right? It's actually this ever shifting quantity. And he says he's ultimately talking about a debate within the socialist movement about how to think about the Soviet Union. But, he says that, you should never think about the idea of a worker state in abstraction. You should think about, this particular worker state at this particular time under these particular historical conditions. Just like you shouldn't think about capitalism in general. You should think about this stage in the development of capitalism at this time, this conditions. And so it's a way of, as you were saying, thinking about messiness and complexity without kind of losing the plot, right?
Right.
And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that article. I talk about it in the book because I think that Trotsky's description of dialectical methodology is really good, but what he says about how that relates to like propositional logic, the kind of logic that's about looking at statements to see if they're true or false, and then to see, okay, if you construct this argument, if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? I think Trotsky sees a relationship between those two things in that article because he's writing in the course of this faction fight with James Burnham, who is a philosophy professor at NYU, and was bringing up some of the logic stuff to Trotsky, and Trotsky kind of overreacting to that, I think, sort of says, oh, that's wrong. You should be thinking about this way instead, when I think what he should have said is that's just irrelevant. That's a different thing, right? That they have that this dialectical method of analysis is totally compatible with classical, propositional logic. And in fact, the ways that I think some people might think they're opposed, this might seem like a digression, but I think it's worth a second on, is that you might think that, traditional logic is going to tell you that everything is either true or untrue or not both, and maybe that's going to erase certain kinds of messiness and complexity. But what I argue in the book is that actually exactly the opposite is true. That when we just use the same statement and then the negation of it, right? We say, oh yeah, P is true and not P is true as a way of kind of gesturing at complexity. We're not really getting into what makes it messy and complicated.
Right.
And so actually what the requirement of logical consistency does is it forces us to spell out the respect in which things are P, the respect in which things are not P. And so that actually forces you to get into all that lovely Hegelian complexity.
And
spelling that out sounds somewhat invidious, and we don't really have time to clean up the mess.
That's MVP shit right there. So in Marx, and then is this the parallel with? Is that Marx takes this and then just materializes it?
Yeah. So
the dialectic becomes, instead of like a contradiction about spirit expressing itself in the German sovereign or the French monarchy, it becomes the contradiction between modes of production, contradiction between labor and ownership, capital and and value, and so on.
Yeah. Absolutely. Instead of, there's still the idea that of historical progress towards a certain notion of freedom. We talked about Marx's notion of freedom earlier, and freedom also from subjugation to the sort of struggle against nature. And I'd say as far as Marx's version of it, actually, one really interesting text to look at as far as Marx's progress, right? Marx starts out as a young Hegelian. There are like left Hegelians who are basically Hegelians who like democratic and even proto-socialist politics, and right Hegelians. And Marx starts out as left Hegelian. And one really interesting text to look at is one of, I think, the most unfairly maligned things that Marx ever wrote, which is on the Jewish question, which if you ever argue with this... If you ever,
Ben, it's kind of okay. David nodded a little too vigorously at that.
Okay. All right. I'm
God, let me tell you something.
Classrooms where even just the title.
Let me tell you something. That's a question you're going to need to ask, sir. Can't avoid. That's a question can't be avoided.
Yeah. Well, the title doesn't age well.
No, it's actually a great essay.
It sounds like something that was written by Richard Spencer.
Right.
And there are quotes which you can find from it where, where Marx is saying things that are not very woke by 21st century standards. And this is actually one of the things that I know this makes me sound like an immensely grumpy old man, but I feel like this is a way in which the internet has made us all a little bit dumber.
Definitely.
That it used to be the case that if you wanted to quote mine a book, you had to actually pick up the book and flip through it to find the passage you wanted to quote. And in the course of flipping through it, you might at least accidentally get some sense of what the rest of the book was about.
Right.
Whereas if you've heard that there are these bad passages on the Jewish question, you can just Google the passage you want without contaminating yourself with any of the rest of the content of the book. So
which is
Marx reacting to some of these other left Hegelians who had more traditional Hegelian ideas, which is to say they thought that ideas rather than legal structures and material reality were the sort of prominent thing, the main force driving history. And so these people thought that in order to have Jewish emancipation, in other words, to change the laws so that Jewish people would have equal rights, then Jewish people would have to give up their own particular religious practices and cultural differences in order to become part of this kind of Republican unity, which is in fact exactly the kind of thinking that still exists, like with France, having, laws against, Muslim women wearing the hijab, things like that. And Marx is arguing against that because he thinks that there's a sort of objective material way of thinking about freedom, that you don't have to change the ideas in your head. You don't have to, like start eating pork to be like everybody else, right? That we could all just have this kind of legal equality. And if there is something that's incomplete about that kind of legal equality, Marx says that it's not that like everybody needs to have the same ideas in their heads so they're part of this great Republican unity. It's that we need social equality to put flesh on the bones of legal equality so that like we have an economic system under which people have meaningful equal status in practice.
Absolutely. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. We'll talk about a little bit more of this in the post game. Plus, we're going to dip into Bernie's cable new public access show archives from the 80s, which I'm extremely excited about. I also just have to say, I don't know how we're going to navigate this, but like, you got to vote for Bernie Sanders. And I mean, I know it's obvious who I support. And I do make caveats. I've made caveats for pretty much every single candidate other than ones that, look, I think Joe Biden, I think Pete Buttigieg. Sorry. I don't have much here.
It needs to be simple. Keep it simple.
Right. I like and respect Elizabeth Warren. Policy wonkery is not a movement.
This is not beanbag.
This is not beanbag. She's the only other candidate that I would support with any measure of enthusiasm in the general election. But I also think that it is a fundamental category mistake to confuse policy innovation with an understanding about the structural barriers in this country.
I think this is an intellectual curiosity expedition.
It's an intellectual curiosity expedition. One of the reasons, I'll just say briefly, and then we do have to get to the postgame, and it freaked a lot of people out. I thought that talking about the problems in Tulsi Gabbard's record and ideology had merit in and of themselves. I also am still willing and have always been willing to give her credit, and I think particularly in a time where AOC is saying she's going to defer to Democratic leadership on Venezuela, I think we have to give Tulsi Gabbard a lot of credit on things like Venezuela. But at the end of the day, I think Bernie Sanders is both on the merits, absolutely the best candidate for president. And he's also the one in clear pole position. So barring like a reversal of the earth, he's going to be, and I do think, I've always thought, frankly, it's a Biden-Bernie race if Biden gets in. I always thought that people in our space drastically underestimated Joe Biden. And I get it, because none of us like him, and there's no reason to like him. But we're not most people. And you got to have a sense of what, and this is an enormously appealing candidate. in a lot of ways, including ways that aren't great. Bhaskar said this very clearly at the live show in New York. He said there's a lot of people that crave normalcy, and they're going to be Biden voters. He nails it. He's someone who understands these dynamics. If I was, I've said a million times, if I was in the center-right lane, I'd be a Kamala Harris person. But I actually think that in some respects, her poise and charisma might be more appealing to people who assess this stuff professionally than for voters. But regardless, I'm not talking like any type of like scorched earth thing, but I think we need to start more robustly articulating what the differences here are. And I think one of the fundamental starting points of having a kind of power analysis in an economic sense of society is that this stuff is not going to happen through technocratic fixes, no matter how enlightened. And when Bernie Sanders comes out and he says, look, you're going to need to, and he doesn't say it this explicitly, but he goes right to the edge of saying, you're going to need to be on the street for me. You can come to Washington with millions of brilliant, beautiful policy ideas. And you know what's going to happen? These oligarchs, these companies are going to spend tens of billions of dollars to destroy it. And that's going to happen regardless of any policy process. And, I don't want to see that progressive lane diluted. So, and I also just feel strongly that what Sanders happens to represent at our time really is unique. It's distinct to have somebody with that sort of understanding of any type of class structure. But anyways.
Could I
yeah, please.
Can I make a point about that?
Yes.
So I know Nancy Pelosi very cynically said that if you nominate somebody too far to the left, Trump isn't going to leave office, or that because she framed it in terms of because there wouldn't be a landslide, it'd be too narrow. But I think that Nancy Pelosi, not for the first time, is full of shit. But I also think that, all right, let's, to use your favorite phrase, right, do the thought experiment, right, and say, all right, what if she was right? Right? What that like Trump actually is in a position to stage a coup, essentially. That's what she's talking about. Yep. And that, the 1% and the intelligence services would go along with that.
Coup.
All right. Who do you think would be best positioned and most understand the need to lead the kind of grassroots army that it would take to restore democracy?
Right.
And I think to ask that question is to answer it.
I agree with you completely. All right, folks.
Just make sure you do it well and you do it with passion.
What the fuck? All right, everybody. I appreciate all of you. We're going to see you in the post game. And she's one of our patrons. Check out her YouTube channel, What Do You Mean, which is actually really fucking smart. She's also running for office in Australia, and we're going to talk about her campaign in the opening of the postgame. And then we have a whole bunch of other sound and all sorts of stuff to get to with the great Ben Burgis. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Thank you, Reniqua Allen. Thank you, Ben Burgis. Thank you to the whole crew. Thank you to each and every one of you. See you in a few minutes.